A while back, I made a video about old anime versus newer anime and looked for an answer to why so many people prefer the older stuff. One of the main takeaways from this was a nostalgia effect, where we unfairly look back selectively, whilst in the present we're forced to witness the mixed bag that is everyday releases. Instead of looking at nostalgia, I wanted to take this argument to the fundamental differences and see if we can find a better answer down this road. What are the fundamental differences between traditional animation, from ink and paint to hand-drawn paper, and digital animation, computer hand-drawn to 3D? What are the differences both technically and reactively from an audience? Does the method of the animation itself play a large role in audience engagement? Is there an animated format which succeeds at drawing in an audience better than another? Is there a larger case to be made for differing animated formats being more or less successful at representing a genre? This reading is going to rely a lot on film analysis. Film analysis itself grew from psychoanalysis, from established figures like Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and Jacques Lacan. Jacques Lacan once held an influential seminar stating, "One finds a guide beyond the imaginary on the level of the symbolic plane." This lays down his proposal of the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. This statement would go on to inspire dozens of film theorists down the line. Louis Althusser, who proposed the apparatus theory, once stated in an essay that we commonly call religious ideology, ethical ideology, legal ideology, political ideology, etc. so many world outlooks. However, while admitting that they do not correspond to reality, i.e. that they constitute an illusion, we admit that they do make allusion to reality and that they need only be interpreted to discover the reality of that world. This has been developed by film theorists into film itself being ideological with a focus on the construction of image of everything within the frame. This theory has extended with modern cinematic analysis as well. I believe that when it comes to animation, there is another layer of the apparatus theory which needs to be pointed out. Whilst considering everything that makes up the frame, it is just as important to consider how the frame has been made. The process of production in animation is just as important as what is inside. In digital animation, this production is purely in software, whilst in traditional, it is entirely analogous. The aesthetic difference between traditional and digital affects how an audience would perceive something like horror, for example. Feeling fear whilst watching an animated horror film might be more successful if the work is animated traditionally. This might be true in reverse as well. Horror in animation is an important conversation, as there is a declining abundance of it with a clear lack of traditional and growing favour of computer-generated animation in today's industry. Without delving into the reasons behind industrial change, let's decipher the forgotten strengths of outdated animation techniques when held against their modern equivalences. I believe these reactions are heavily affected by the format that a film is developed in. The early days of 3D, particularly that featured in children's animated cartoons of the 1990s, now appear crude and were developed in much simpler quality than that of today. Looking back, the misshapen and underdeveloped look of older digitally animated cartoons now seem to create an entirely different reaction. As digital ages, it draws different responses from its audience, as new standards are continually advanced and improved, leaving the old very much behind. The clear difference between digital 2D and traditional 2D is that the age of traditional is over, whilst digital is at its prime. Furthermore, traditional animation has an analogous nature which cannot age in the same way that digital animation has, is, and will continue to. This difference would seemingly favour traditional techniques, but there's more to it than that. The early, unrefined days of digital animation have grown to draw different responses from its modern audience. Traditional animation has a different feel to modern audiences because of the now antiquated nature of its construction. As practices evolve, traditional methods become increasingly antiquated, whilst older attempts at digitalized 2D have aged into semi-obscurity. In current times, the internet has become a great resource of sharing and viewing unknown animations like this. An effect sometimes occurs when animations age, where the viewer perceives it in a new way than they originally did. This isn't lack of memory or change of mind, but the standards of animation progressing and leaving behind these mementos, which clash strongly enough to create a new reaction on a viewer altogether. Why is that? My argument is that the reaction which cell animation elicits from an audience is fundamentally different from that of digital. From a purely technical aspect, it's easy to see why. Both these methods are easily distinguishable, with pixelation, vector-assisted line art, and hyperdynamic possibilities being symptomatic of digital, whilst painted canvas, occasional errors, and a relatively simplistic colorization process are symptomatic of traditional. Louis Althusser, responsible for the inception of apparatus theory, once said, "The material existence of the ideology in an apparatus and its practices does not have the same modality as the material existence of a paving stone or a rifle." But at the risk of being taken for a neo-Aristotelian, I shall say that matter is discussed in many senses, or rather that it exists in different modalities, all rooted in the last instance in physical matter. This statement holds true both in terms of usage in cinematic analysis, but also for my intent to analyse animated cinematic texts. Similar to how apparatus theory supplies us with the framework to analyse and discern where the distinctive identities of these two formats lie, mise-en-scène is a term defined by André Brézin that allows us to study and analyse the inner contents of a frame. He said that mise-en-scène is emphasising choreographed movement within the scene rather than through editing. This allows us to pick apart a frame's contents and analyse them. In the case of animation, this is true in a different way. The composition of an animation is that of multiple frames overlaid each other in order to give a complete cinematic image. The mise-en-scène in animation can now be seen as these individual layers, which make up the whole image. Similarly to the concept of apparatus theory, Althusser coined the concept of interpellation as an effect that ideologues quickly hold upon pre-ideological subjects, saying, "As a first formulation I shall say, all ideology hails or interpellates concrete individuals or concrete subjects, by the functioning of the category of the subject. Thus, ideology hails or interpellates individuals or subjects." This is a formulation which holds true in cinema, that an audience member can view a text and be subjected to the context of that world, or, so to speak, be interpellated. Judith Mayne took this formulation further in her 1993 essay on cinema and spectatorship, writing, "Spectatorship involves the acts of looking and hearing in as much as the patterns of everyday life are dramatised, foregrounded, displaced, or otherwise inflected by the cinema." Where Freud, Lacan, Jung, and Althusser paved the way for conceptual revelations, film theorists like Mayne advanced ideas of analysis. Laura Mulvey is another iconic film theorist to formulate these ideas. With a Freudian background, she develops the concept of phallocentrism and applies it to an apparatus of film by stating that the camera represents a male's gaze, and coining that term. Her iconic essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, goes into this with greater detail, more than I can anyway, but either way, an important aspect of analysis is being able to understand this, that a text's mise-en-scène is constructed in order to position a spectator towards a specific reaction. So, to acknowledge each of these theories, the spectator watches the apparatus of the text. If the text successfully positions them, they become interpellated into the world of the text. This is a vital understanding when it comes to reading cinematic texts, as it supplies us with the ability to qualitatively explain how an audience may react differently to animation. The conditions of interpellation are heavily grounded in the careful construction of film language, the apparatus, and can change drastically with simple aesthetic changes like traditional or digital formats. With visuals relying completely on artistic drawings, animation is a different type of visual for the spectator to respond to. As live-action cinema mimics our reality, animation has the potential to resemble something completely different, as the mise-en-scène is artistically constructed with materials, instead of physical bodies. Digital animation in terms of physical creativity is actually more limiting than traditional animation. With traditional practices conducted entirely in analogous methods, there is much more room for physical experimentation and manipulation. This is developed further in an essay titled Digital Animation as a Method of Inquiry. In it, Mallory Spicer posits that animation as a method of inquiry can be seen at the heart of many experimental and independent creations throughout the art form's history, as well as in the present. Many of the first experimental animators were musicians or painters by trade, looking for new ways and new dimensions to further their work. Originating from artists' desire for further expression, animation is something which naturally takes a different tone from live-action cinema, and this contrast is what allows the spectator to reach more nuanced responses. The symbolic meaning behind drawings can be manipulated much more with animation than with film. Its artistic nature lies in semiotics, the study of signs and symbols. In the fashion of advancing pre-existing theories and essays, Betsy Weiss challenged Mayne's essay of spectator theory, stating that Mayne stresses throughout her book the need for theorists to consider their own influences in any analysis of spectatorship, yet allusions to her own positioning are limited. Weiss implies the significance of one's own positioning, and this is something which I want to make clear. I believe that studying and inspecting animation can reveal a new area of the apparatus theory. To give the best exemplary analyses, I will be looking at two texts, one digitally developed and one traditionally developed. To analyse both in a similar vein, I will study two different animated texts which bear great similarities and are deserving of comparison. Because of this, I will be analysing Ghost in the Shell, originally conceived by Masamune Shirow. The first adaptation of this work was animated on Cell as an anime film by Mamoru Oshii. Another adaptation was animated digitally by Kazuya Nomura and Kazuchika Kisei. The aesthetic visuals for both of these movies differ enormously, despite the latter following very reminiscent designs to that of the former. In Oshii's adaptation of Ghost in the Shell, the opening sequence is a chilling introduction to the cybernetic world, with an animated cyborg being assembled. The stark yet pale colours of the acrylic and the slight bleeding of light into the frame add to this image of the skin being dried. The jagged lines of the factory's architecture blend with this colour to create a really unsettling mise-en-scène. The dark background draws greater attention to the intricately inked line art, which cohesively joins as the shot progresses. The addition of Kenji Kawai's haunting music, filled with chimes and rhythmic humming, creates an almost trance-like effect which completes the opening to the world of the film as a heavily advanced alien setting. Starting with the sequence teaches us, the spectator, that we are about to watch a jarringly different sci-fi world and prepares us tonally for what is to come. It eases us into the world slowly. In the opening sequence of Ghost in the Shell, the new movie, 2015, there is a somber introduction for Kusanagi, the main protagonist, interacting with a dysfunctional cyborg. The art style, whilst closely resembling the original film, is clearly produced in a different method, with a faded colorization, backgrounds that are computer generated, and line art that has a pixelated appearance. The music, this time composed by Keigo Oyamada, is similarly trance-like and plays over a dialogueless sequence, but instead of being robotic and unnerving in nature, this arrangement is played on a piano to great surreal effect. Whilst following the style of the original, the 3D backgrounds and 2D digital animation give off a different effect, despite the both of them grasping for the same style. Where Ghost in the Shell 1995 gives off the sense of a jarringly abstract dystopia, Ghost in the Shell, the new movie, offers but a jarringly abstract visual aberration to its own precedent. The original Ghost in the Shell revealed on the bonus feature production report that the film was actually animated with a process called DGA, Digitally Generated Animation. DGA was thought to be the future of animation at that time, involving traditional cells alongside the manipulation of a large canvas to create a 3D rotating landscape which could stretch as the actors in the frame come in and out of focus to varying degrees. This process, which did not become the future of animation, gives the film its unique and individualized appearance. Whilst DGA animation did not become a common practice in the industry, it did bring my attention towards a potential explanation towards the film's success, especially when compared to its modern counterpart. Whilst old methods of production and distribution may be neglected with time, it can actually increase the level of interpolation for a spectator. In a video essay titled The Power of VHS Scanline, H-Bomber Guy raises the point that VHS, another outdated format, has grown fondly in the memories of so many, not because of its merit, but because of the very lack that it had when compared to what is available today. He says, in its own way, whether we like it or not, those tapes and the impact that they had will never leave us. The format is in our history now, and we remember it. Nostalgia is real, and it affects how we view old films or perceive new films. He argues that the limitations of the now dead format have added a charm. This is a point consolidated by Brian Eno. Whatever you now find weird, ugly, uncomfortable, and nasty about a new medium will surely become its signature. The excitement of grainy film, of bleached out black and white, is the excitement over witnessing events too momentous for the medium assigned to record them. This is something that can be argued for the current animation industry. Though it's tough to work with traditional animation, it holds a charm of its own. If DGA animation had been easier to manufacture than digital animation, it might well have become the dominant format. Regardlessly, this effect explains my two responses from Ghost in the Shell and its two adaptations. Where Cell couldn't easily be used to create a dynamic shot in the same way that digital can, it compensated for this with other elements that digital animation doesn't have. The different aesthetics of colorization and inked artwork simply give off an alternative effect on the spectator, however small it might be. This, at least in my eyes, is proof of the fundamental difference to watching the two and responding in a unique way for both. With this assertion, we can observe the quality of traditional animation in a new lens. On another note, it should also be added that the Ghost in the Shell franchise just got another anime adaptation. Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045 is animated digitally, opting for 3D computer-generated animation instead of either of the preceding styles. From the background art to the character models and the effects, everything in this animation is 3D and unlike any of the animation from either of the previous adaptations. Where the two aforementioned adaptations have occasional 3D, which is cel-shaded to resemble 2D illustrations, this new adaptation is solely 3D. The colour palette and composition of the different shots are all bright and colourful, furthering the difference between it and its predecessors. The trailer for this series released on YouTube on the 22nd of October 2019 by Netflix, and it was received with enormous backlash. Complaints predominantly targeted the animation, citing the visual tone's inconsistency with previous incarnations of the franchise as a source of disappointment. Despite this, it highlights the importance of stylistic synergy for a franchise. Whilst both digital and traditional methods of 2D are more similar to each other than they are to Ghost in the Shell SAC 2045, the response from many different spectators displayed a clear preferential response to a different style than the one used. This has obstructed the process of interpolation for enough spectators that they have supplied us with a quantitative result, with a dislike ratio of 6,000 likes to 7,000 dislikes. This problem of audiences being unable to reach interpolation and of them starting a backlash against the product is something which can be seen largely in today's, again, heavily digital animation industry. Movies like Sonic the Hedgehog create such a profoundly negative backlash from its audience that the executive decision was made to prolong production to fix it. For this film, complaints sprouted for Sonic's character modelling, particularly towards his human-like appearances and lack of similarity to his original 2D character model, which everyone knew and apparently loved. Another interesting example of this can be deciphered from the Thundercats franchise, originally aired from 1985 to 1989. Once a successful cartoon in the 80s, Thundercats was greenlit for a reboot in 2020 titled Thundercats Roar, which overhauled the artistic style completely. Where the original series featured realistic anatomy and shading techniques, the reboot offered a vastly simplified art style with a clear adherence to less realistic anatomy. The trailer for Thundercats Roar features one of the protagonists of the franchise, Lion-O, who breaks the fourth wall and addresses the audience whilst flaunting his sword. The anatomy of this character is profoundly rotund and harkens back to the style of Max Fleisch's cartoons, which became very influential in the 1930s. Betty Boop and Popeye come to mind. This tubular design, commonly referred to as rubber hose, contrasts starkly with the realistic design and dramatic writing of the original TV show. Alternatively, the opening of the original Thundercats TV show features greatly detailed cell animation, which has realistic anatomy in terms of muscular composition, dynamic fighting choreography, and backgrounds that are fully painted on canvas. The original show not only has a more mature visual presentation, but a more serious approach to sound design too. The sound effects and background tracks are striking and rapid, compounding a sense of excitement into the footage of the main characters fighting in the background. The voice work for the characters is performed in a more straightforward manner with normally pitched voices and dramatic acting. This element is the complete opposite for the remake, which features high-pitched voices and a looseness to the flow of dialogue that pairs with its visuals to create a more accepting, friendly demeanour for the consumption of a younger audience, no less, but obviously you could say the same for the prior as well. This is something which is purposeful but creates such stark opposition to the original work that it became a questionable choice for many fans. Now, this contrast is something that didn't settle well with those who reached interpolation when watching the original show, as signified by the response to this reboot. In the trailer's YouTube video, the like to dislike ratio is 8.5 likes to an overwhelming 116,000 dislikes. This is a very strong instance of audience backlash and supports the notion that many people were either positioned strongly against the reboot due to the precedent of the original, or that they simply did not feel interpolation due to the style of the show to begin with. There is also a case to be made for a mixture of these two effects both occurring at the same time. Though it might seem that the stylistic difference is at fault, we can still use this as a talking point for the fundamental differences of animation, as the original show was animated traditionally and the new show digitally. John Quick-Falusi, creator of the Ren and Stimpy show, sparked fierce debate on the topic when stating that they kept doing the same things over and over again, and that's what all the animators copy today, the decadent stuff, rather than the skills. Unfortunately, the people who grow up inspired by copies of 60s Disney's animation learn to accept these few superficial stylistic things and don't realise they are doing it. Kricfalusi summarises the background of the term CalArts in this statement, something which he is attributed to have coined, though the webpage for this essay no longer exists. That won't stop people from bringing it up still. Despite the deletion of this page, the outcry lives on. CalArt style is a derogative term towards animation that resembles a uniform appeal to the mainstream. Taking the abbreviation for California Institute of the Arts, the term takes aim at this school due to the alumni producing the majority of these animations, all adopting the same style. John Ma, writer for internet news website Polygon, says the pushback against Thundercats Roar is a fair critique. Art is all about preference after all. But art is also about evolution and personal instincts. Rebecca Sugar's designs for Steven Universe come from her own love of video games and Bauhaus theory. The idea that Thundercats Raw style is part of a monoculture produced by college instruction fails to examine history. He goes on to detail how famous animators like Rebecca Sugar, who worked on Steven Universe, have no prior connection to CalArts, and therefore makes the term itself inaccurate. Ma refuses the term itself, but fails to dismantle the argument that Kricfalusi set up. The existence of CalArts as a derogative term implies that there is support towards my argument of the fundamental differences between spectators' reactions, though claims remain unsubstantiated and very underdeveloped. Whilst argument is rife, there is a clear dissonance with some people in this audience, and it is something that today's heavily digital animation industry has had to adjust to. Be it in the form of Sonic the Hedgehog the movie, and its year-long stylistic reconfiguration, or be it in the form of Cuphead, and their complete production overhaul from traditional to digital, the ways in which a spectator becomes interpellated are largely affected by production, and that is the main answer to the question of whenever anyone says, what happened to anime? If you throw a buck my way, like these lovely people, you'll get access to the script for my next video and get to see the video before anyone else. There are no tiers, just videos for a buck. But if you want to put down more than that, then that's greatly appreciated as well. Subscribe, comment your thoughts down below, and have a wonderful night.